Section 5 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ali May. The Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1, by Arthur Griffiths, Section 5. Chapter 3, Newgate in the 17th Century. The disturbing elements of society continued much the same in the early part of the 17th century as in the years immediately preceding. There were the same offences against law and order, dealt with in the same summary fashion. Newgate was perpetually crowded with prisoners charged with the same sort of crimes. Bigotry and intolerance continued to breed persecution. All sects which differed from the faith professed by those in power were in turn under the ban of the law. The Romish priest still ventured into the hostile heretic land where his life was not worth a minute's purchase. Puritans and nonconformists were committed to jail for refusing to surrender their heterodox opinions. These last coming into power were ruthlessly strict towards the openly irreligious backslider. Side by side with these sufferers in the cause of independent thought swarmed the depredators, the wrong-doers, whose criminal instincts and the actions they produced were much the same as they had been before, and as they are now. The devoted courage of the Jesuit emissaries in those days of extreme peril for all priests who dared to cross the Channel claims for them a full measure of respect. They were forever in trouble. When caught, they met hard words, scant mercy, often only a short shrift. Repeated references are made to them. In the State Papers, July 1602, is a list of priests and rescuants in prison, viz. Newgate, Pound, already mentioned, desperate and obstinate. In the Clink, Marshalsea, King's Bench, are others. Among them Douce, a forward intelligence, Twitchborne, Webster, perverter of youth, etc. They were ever the victims of treachery and espionage. William Richardson, a priest of Seville College, the date is 1603, was discovered to the Chief Justice by one whom he trusted, and arraigned and condemned at Newgate for being a priest and coming to England. When examined he answered stoutly, yet with great modesty and discretion, moving many to compassionate him and speak against the Chief Justice, on whom he laid the guilt of his blood. He was executed at Tyburn, hanged and quartered, but his head and quarters were buried. Such spectacles, says the writer, Ant Avers to Giacomo Gretolo, Venice, do nothing to increase the gospel. A further account says that William Richardson, alias Anderson, was betrayed by a false brother, sent to Newgate, and kept close prisoner over a week, no one being allowed to see him. The Chief Justice, interrupting other trials, called for him, and caused him to be indicted of high treason for being a priest and coming to England, all of which he confessed, and there being no evidence against him, the Chief Justice gave his confession in writing to the jury, who found him guilty. He thanked God, and told the Chief Justice he was a bloody man, and sought the blood of the Catholics. He denied that he was a Jesuit or New Garnet. Priests were subject to espionage even beyond the realm. A deposition is given in the State Papers made by one Arthur Saul, to the effect that he had been employed by Secretary Winwood and the Archbishop of Canterbury to report what English were at Douay College, particulars of priests who have returned to England, of their meeting places and conveyance of letters. These were days of widespread oppression, when Strafford, Laud, the Star Chamber, and ecclesiastical courts gave effect to the king's eager longings for arbitrary power. The following is from a half-mad fanatic who has offended the relentless Archbishop. The petition of Richard Farnham, a prophet of the Most High God, a true subject to my King and a prisoner of my Saviour Christ, in Newgate, to Archbishop Laud and the rest of the High Commissioners, whom he prays to excuse his plainness, being no scholar. Desires to know the cause of his being detained so long in prison, where he has been kept a year next April, without coming to his answer. Thinks they have forgotten him. If he be a false prophet, and a blasphemer and a seducer, as most people report that he is, the High Commissioners would do well to bring him to trial. What he wrote before he came into prison, and what he has written since, he will stand to. If he does not get his answer this summer, he intends to complain to the king, believing that it is not his pleasure his subjects should suffer false imprisonment, to satisfy the Archbishop's mind. Of the same year, and the same character, is this other petition from William King, a prisoner in Newgate, for a little treatise delivered to Lord Leppington. Has remained in thraldom 27 months. Expresses contrition and prays enlargement on bail, or that he may be called to answer. 40 years more were to elapse before the passing of the Habeas Corpus Act. But the foregoing will show how grievously this so-called palladium of an Englishman's liberties was required. Pardons, free or more or less conditional, were, however, vouchsafed at times. Release from prison was still as before, and for long after, frequently accompanied by the penalty of military service. This had long been the custom. On declaration of war in the earlier reigns, it was usual to issue a proclamation offering a general pardon to those guilty of homicides and felonies, on condition of service for a year and a day. Even without this obligation, prisoners in durance might sue out a pardon by intercession of some nobleman serving abroad with the king. But later on the release was distinctly conditional on personal service. The Lord Mayor certifies to the king (1619) that certain prisoners in Newgate, whose names and offences are given, are not committed for murder, so they are reprieved as being able-bodied and fit to do service in foreign parts. Another certificate states that William Dominic, condemned to death for stealing a purse, value £4, is reprieved, this being his first offence, and he an excellent drummer fit to do the king's service. Again, the king requires the keeper of Newgate to deliver certain reprieved prisoners to Sir Edward Conway, Jr., to be employed in his Majesty's service in the Low Countries. Recorder Finch reports that he has furnished Conway's son with 7 prisoners fit for service, sends a list of prisoners now in Newgate, but reprieves. Some have been long in jail, and were saved from execution by the prince's return, with Buckingham from Spain, on that day. They pester the jail, which is already reported crowded this hot weather, and would do better service as soldiers, if pardoned, for they would not dare to run away. A warrant is made out, June 5, 1629, to the sheriffs of London to deliver such persons as the Swedish ambassador shall appoint, 47 persons, one of whom was Elizabeth Leach. Was she to be employed as a sutler or a vivendiere? Being prisoners condemned of felonies, and remaining in the jails of Newgate and Bridewell, who are released, to the end that they may be employed in the service of the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, at that time our ally. There are numerous entries of this kind in the state papers. Sometimes the prisoners volunteer for service. John Taps, by the displeasure of the late Lord Chief Justice, and the persecution of James the clerk and one of the keepers, has been kept from the benefit of the pardon which has been stayed at the Great Seal, begs Lord Conway to perfect his work by moving the Lord Keeper on his behalf, and in the meantime sending some powerful warrant for his employment as a soldier. Certain other convicted prisoners in Newgate, who had been pardoned in respect of the birth of Prince Charles II, petitioned that they are altogether impoverished and unable to sue out their pardons. They pray that by warrant they may be transported into the state of Venice under the command of Captain Ludovic Hamilton. This document is endorsed with a reference to the Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas to certify concerning these delinquents and their crimes. George Gardiner, a prisoner in Newgate, also petitions the king in March 1630, stating that he was committed by the council on the information of James Ingram, deputy warden of the Fleet, to prevent petitioner prosecuting the said Ingram for his notorious extortions. He has remained in Newgate since April previous, and by Ingram's procurement was shut up amongst felons in the common jail, whereby he might have been murdered, and prays that he may be allowed to go abroad on security. Here is another petition, that of Bridget Gray to the council. She states, July 19, 1618, that her grandson, John Throckmorton, is a prisoner in Newgate for felony, and prays that he may be discharged, this being his first offence, and Sir Thomas Smythe being ready to convey him beyond seas. Upon this is endorsed an order that if the mayor or recorder will certify that Throckmorton was not convicted of murder, burglary, highway robbery, rape, or witchcraft, a warrant may be made for his banishment. The certificate is forthcoming, and is to the effect that Throckmorton's crime was aiding in stealing a hat, value 6 shillings, for which the principal, Robert Wisson, an old thief, was hanged. The jail calendar reflects the vicissitudes of these changing, troublous times. There were many London citizens who, sharing the patriotic spirit of Hampden and Pym, found themselves imprisoned for refusing to submit to the illegal taxations of Charles I. In 1639 3 citizens stand committed to Newgate, not because they refused to pay ship money, but because they refused to enter into bond to attend the board to answer their not paying the same. Divers others refused, and were sent to Newgate, but upon better consideration they paid their money and were released again. The temper of the government as regards ship money is further shown by the arrest and trial of the keeper of Newgate for permitting a prisoner committed for non-payment of this unlawful tax to go at large. It appears that the offender, Richard Chambers, had been several times remanded to the same custody, and had been allowed to escape. It was highly dangerous to speak lightly of dignities in these ticklish times. The state trials give an account of the hard measures meted out to one Edward Floyd for scandalizing the Princess Palatine Elizabeth, daughter of James I and titular Queen of Bohemia. Floyd was charged with having said, while he was a prisoner in the Fleet, "I have heard that Prague is taken, and good man Palsgrave and good wife Palsgrave have taken to their heels and run away." This puerile gossip seriously occupied both Houses of Parliament, and eventually the Lords awarded and adjudged that Edward Floyd be deemed an infamous person, incapable of bearing arms as a gentleman, whose testimony was not to be taken in any court or cause. He was also sentenced to ride with his head to his horse's tail from Westminster to the pillory in Cheapside, after this to be whipped from the Fleet to Westminster, there again to stand on the pillory. He was to pay a fine of £5,000 to the king, and be imprisoned in Newgate during his life. There is nothing especially remarkable in the purely criminal cases of this period. Offences have a strong family likeness to those of our own day. Culprits are cast for life for taking a chest of plate out of a house, or for taking £100 from a gentleman, and so forth. Now and again appears a case of abduction, a common crime in those and latter days. Sarah Cox prays the king's pardon for Roger Fulwood, who was convicted of felony for forcibly marrying her against her will, but she begs at the same time for protection for person and estate from any claims in regard to the pretended marriage. Knights of the Road have already begun to operate. They have already the brevet rank of captain, and even lads of tender years are beguiled into adopting the profession of highway robbery. Counterfeiting the king's or other great seals was an offence not unknown. A Captain Farrer is lodged in Newgate, 1639, accused of counterfeiting His Majesty's signature and privy signet. His method of procedure was simple. Having received a document bearing His Majesty's privy seal for the payment of a sum of £190, he removed the seal and affixed it to a paper purporting to be a licence from the king to levy and transport 200 men beyond seas. This he published as a royal licence. When arraigned, he admitted that the charge was true, but pleaded that he had done the same according to the king's commands. He was reprieved until further orders. The conditions of the prisoners within Newgate continued very deplorable. This is apparent from the occasional reference to their treatment. They were heavily ironed, lodged in loathsome dungeons, and all but starved to death. Poor Stephen Smith, the fishmonger, who had contravened the precautionary rules against the plague, petitions the council that he has been very heavily laden with such intolerable bolts and shackles that he is lamed, and being a weak and aged man, is likely to perish in the jail. Having always lived in good reputation, and been a liberal benefactor where he has long dwelt, he prays enlargement on security. The prison is so constantly overcrowded that the prisoners have an infectious malignant fever which sends many to their long home, The magistrates who think them unfit to breathe their native air when living bury them as brethren when dead. All kinds of robbery and oppression were practised within the precincts of the jail. Inside, apart from personal discomfort, the inmates do much as they please. "There are seditious preachings by Fifth Monarchy men at Newgate," says the records, "and prayers for all righteous blood." Some time previous, when the Puritans were nominally the weakest, they also held their services in the prison. Samuel Eaton, a prisoner committed to Newgate as a dangerous schismatic, is charged with having conventicles in the jail, some to the number of 70 persons. He was, moreover, permitted by the keeper to preach openly. The keeper was petitioned by one of the inmates to remove Eaton and send him to some other part of the prison, but he replied disdainfully, threatening to remove the petitioner to a worse place. An instruction to the Lord Mayor and sheriffs in the State Papers, December 1649, directs them to examine the miscarriages of the under-officers of Newgate, who were favourers of the felons and robbers there committed, and to remove such as appear faulty. The nefarious practices of the Newgate officers were nothing new. They are set forth with much quaintness of diction and many curious details in a pamphlet of the period, entitled The Black Dog of Newgate. There was a tavern entitled the Dog Tavern in Newgate, as appears by the State Papers, where the place is indicated by an informer for improper practices. The pamphlet sheds a strong light upon the evil doings of the turnkeys, who appear to have been guilty of the grossest extortion, taking advantage of their position as officers of the law to levy blackmail alike on criminals and their victims. Of these swindling turnkeys or bailiffs, whom the writer designates coney catchers, he tells many discreditable tales. The term coney catching had long been in use to define a species of fraud akin to our modern confidence trick, or as the French call it, the vol américain. Shakespeare, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, makes Falstaff call Bardolph, Nymph, and Pistol coney-catching rascals. The fraud was then of but recent introduction. It is detailed at length by Robert Greene in his notable discovery of cozenage, published in 1591. He characterizes it as a new art. 3 parties were needed to practice it, called respectively the setter, the verser, and the barnacle. Their game, or victim, was the coney. The first was the decoy, the second was a confederate who plied the coney with drink, the third came in by accident should the efforts of the others to beguile the coney into a deceit at cards have failed. In the end the countryman was completely despoiled. Later on there was a new nomenclature. The setter became the beater. The tavern to which the rogues adjourned was the Bush, and the quarry was the Bird. The verser was the retriever, the barnacle was the pot hunter, and the game was called bat-fowling. Green's exposure was supposed to have deprived the coney-catchers of a collop of their living, but they still prospered at their nefarious practices, according to the author of The Black Dog. Plain symptoms of the approaching struggle between the King and the Commons are to be met with in the prison records. Immediately after the meeting of the Long Parliament, orders were issued for the enlargement of many victims of Star Chamber oppression. Among them was the celebrated Prynne, author of the Histriomatrix, who had lost his ears in the pillory, Burton, a clergyman, and Bastwick, a physician, who had suffered the same penalties, all came out of prison triumphant, wearing ivy and rosemary in their hats. Now Strafford was impeached and presently beheaded. Laud also was condemned. The active interference of Parliament in all affairs of state extended to the arrest of persons suspected of treasonable practices. There are many cases of imprisonment, more or less arbitrary, in these troubled times. Another petition may be quoted, that of Richard Overton, a prisoner in the most contemptible jail of Newgate, under an order of the House of Lords. Overton tells us how he was brought before the House in a warlike manner, under pretence of a criminal fact, and called upon to answer interrogations concerning himself, which he conceived to be illegal and contrary to the national rights, freedoms, and properties of the free commoners of England, confirmed to them by Magna Charta, the Petition of Right, and the Act for the abolishment of the Star Chamber. Overton was therefore emboldened to refuse subjection to the said House. He was adjudged guilty of contempt and committed to Newgate, where he was seemingly doomed to lie until their lordships' pleasure should be further signified, which may be perpetual if they please, and may have their wills, for your petitioner humbly conceiveth that he is made a prisoner to their wills, not to the law, except their wills may be a law. On this account he appealed to the Commons as the most sovereign court of judicature in the land, claiming from them repossession of his just liberty and freedom, or else that he may undergo the penalty prescribed by the law if he be found a transgressor. Whether Overton was supported by the Commons against the Lords does not appear, but within 3 years the Lower House abolished the House of Peers. Here is yet another petition from a better-known inmate of Newgate, the obstinately independent Colonel Lilburne, commonly called Freeborn John. Lilburne was always at loggerheads with the government of the city. In 1637, when following the trade of a bookseller, he was convicted by the Star Chamber for publishing seditious libels, and sentenced to the pillory, imprisonment, and a fine of £5,000. In 1645 he fell foul of the Parliament, and wrote a new treatise calling in question their power. Lilburne was eventually banished by the Rump Parliament, but in 1653 he returned to England, and threw himself upon the tender mercies of the Protector. Cromwell would do nothing, and left him to the law. Lilburne was then arrested and committed to Newgate. At the next session he was arraigned, but refused to plead unless furnished with a copy of his indictment. He managed to put off his trial by various expedients till the next sessions, when he was acquitted by the jury. In Thurloe's State Papers it is stated that John Lilburne was 5 times at his trial at the Sessions House, where he most courageously defended himself from the Recorder's violent assaults with his old buckler, the Magna Charta, so that they have left him alone. Freeborn John was so popular with malcontents of all shades of opinion that the authorities, from Oliver Cromwell downward, were really afraid of him. Oliver professed to be enraged against him, and anxious for his punishment, yet he privately paid him a pension equal to the pay of a lieutenant-colonel, and, as Thurloe says, thought the fellow so considerable that during the time of his trial he kept 3 regiments continually under arms at St. James. The jury which acquitted Lilburne were summoned to answer for their conduct before the Council of State, yet there is little doubt that the court was overawed by the mob, for Thurloe says there were 600 or 700 men at the trial, with swords, pistols, bills, daggers, and other instruments that, in case they had not cleared him, they would have employed in his defence. The joy and acclamation were so great after he was acquitted that the shout was heard an English mile. All this time prisoners of great mark were at times confined in Newgate. That noted royalist, Judge Jenkins, was among the number. His crime was publishing seditious books, and sentencing to death people who had assisted against the Parliament. He was indeed attainted of high treason under an ordinance passed by the House of Commons. A committee was sent from the Commons House to Newgate, which was to interview Judge Jenkins, and make the following offer to him, viz., that if he would own the power of Parliament to be lawful, they would not only take off the sequestrations from his estates, amounting to £500 per annum, but they would also settle a pension on him of £1,000 a year. His reply was to the following effect: "Far be it from me to own rebellion, although it was lawful and successful." As the judge refused to come to terms with them, he remained in Newgate till the Restoration. People of still higher rank found themselves in jail. The brother of the Portugal ambassador, Don Pantaleon Sa, is sent, with others, to Newgate for a murder committed by them near the Exchange. It was a bad case. They had quarrelled with an English officer, Gerard, who, hearing the Portuguese discoursing in French upon English affairs, told them they did not represent certain passages aright. One of the foreigners gave him the lie, and all 3 fell upon him and stabbed him with a dagger, but Colonel Gerard being rescued out of their hands by one Mr. Anthurser, they retired home, and within 1 hour returned with 20 more, armed with breastplate and headpieces. But after 2 or 3 turns, not finding Mr. Anthurser, they returned home that night. Next day the Portuguese fell upon a Colonel Mayo, mistaking him for Anthuther, wounding him dangerously, and killed another person, Mr. Greenaway. The murderers were arrested in spite of the protection afforded them by the Portuguese ambassador, and committed to Newgate. Don Pantaleon made his escape from prison a few days later, but he was retaken. Strenuous efforts were then made to obtain his release. His trial was postponed on the petition of the Portuguese merchants. The Portuguese ambassador himself had an audience of Cromwell, the Lord Protector, but the law took its course. Don Pantaleon pleaded his relationship, and that he had a commission to act as ambassador in his brother's absence. This was disallowed, and after much argument the prisoners pleaded guilty, and desired to be tried by God and the country. A jury was called, half denizens, half aliens, 6 of each, who, after a full hearing, found the ambassador's brother and 4 others guilty of murder and felony. The Lord Chief Justice Rolls then sentenced them to be hanged, and fixed the day of execution, but by the desire of the prisoners it was respited 2 days. This was the 6th July, 1654. On the 8th, Don Pantaleon Sa had his sentence commuted to beheading. On the 10th he tried to escape, without success, and on the same day he was conveyed from Newgate to Tower Hill in a coach and 6 horses in mourning, with divers of his brother's retinue with him. There he laid his head on the block, and it was chopped off at 2 blows. The rest, although condemned, were all reprieved except one, an English boy concerned in the murder, who was hanged at Tyburn. Their first victim, Colonel Gerard, survived only to be executed on Tower Hill the same year for conspiring to murder the Lord Protector. Other distinguished inmates a few years later were Charles Lord Buckhurst, Edward Sackville, and Sir Henry Belays, K.B., who, being prisoners in Newgate, petitioned the Lord Chief Justice March 10th to be admitted to bail, one of them being ill of the smallpox. They were charged seemingly with murder. Their petition sets forth that while returning from Waltham to London on the 8th February, they aided some persons who complained that they had been robbed and wounded in pursuit of the thieves, and in attacking the robbers wounded one who afterward died. Sir Thomas Towris, Baronet, petitions the King, Charles II, not to suffer him to lie in that infamous place, where he has not an hour of health nor the necessaries of life. He states that he has been 4 months in the Tower and 5 weeks in Newgate, charged with counterfeiting his Majesty's hand by the malice of an infamous person, who, when registrar accountant at Worcester House, sold false debentures. Sir Thomas wished to lay his case before his Majesty at his first coming from Oxford, but was deceived, and the way to bounty was thus stopped. End of Section 5.